Welcome back, seekers of forgotten tales. I am Osric the Tale-Binder, and tonight, a night of howling winds most fitting for our tale, we delve into one of the most terrifying legends of medieval Europe, the Wild Hunt of King Herla. Have you ever felt a chill upon your spine when the wind howls through bare branches? Have our ancestors' warnings about avoiding lonely roads on stormy nights ever echoed in your mind? Perhaps ancient wisdom still whispers to us, for throughout medieval Europe, it was widely believed that on certain nights, a spectral procession rode furiously across the sky, a host of the damned led by a cursed king, bringing misfortune or death to all who witnessed their passing. Unlike our previous tales of green children or distant Christian kingdoms, this legend speaks not of wonder or hope, but of terror and doom. For to see the wild hunt was to risk being swept away with it forever, or worse, to foresee one's own imminent death. Tonight, we shall focus on the British telling of this legend, the tale of King Herla, an ancient British ruler who visited the realm of the fairy folk and returned to find himself cursed to ride for eternity at the head of a ghostly procession. Listen closely, dear viewers, but pray you never hear the distant horns of the wild hunt upon the midnight air. The wild hunt appears in folklore across Europe. From the frozen fjords of Scandinavia to the mist-shrouded valleys of the Alps, from the dark forests of Germany to the windswept moors of Britain. Though the details vary, the core of the legend remains chillingly consistent, a supernatural hunting party thundering across the night sky, bringing terror to those below. The origins of this belief stretch back into the pre-Christian past. In the Norse tradition, the hunt was led by Odin himself, the one-eyed All-Father, riding his eight-legged steed Sleipnir as he gathered the souls of the dead. The Germans spoke of Wotan leading his ghostly retinue through winter storms. In parts of France, it was Harlequin, a demonic figure whose name may be the root of our modern Harlequin. But how did such similar legends emerge across such distant lands? Some scholars suggest the wild hunt represents ancient memories of migratory warrior bands or reflects the terrifying raids of the Vikings. Others see it as a mythological explanation for the howling winter storms that sweep across northern Europe, with the sound of wind in the trees, reminiscent of baying hounds and thundering hooves. Christian interpretation later transformed these pagan myths. The wild hunt became a procession of the damned sinners condemned to ride eternally as punishment for their earthly misdeeds. The church used these tales to warn against sin, particularly against hunting on holy days, a common theme in many versions of the legend. But the version we explore tonight, the tale of King Herla, offers a different origin for this ghostly company. Not divine punishment, but a fairy curse that trapped an ancient king between worlds, forcing him to ride forever through a land that was no longer his own. The earliest written account of King Herla appears in the works of Walter Map, a 12th century Welsh writer who served at the court of King Henry II of England. In his work De Nugis Curialium, Courtiers' Trifles, Map recounts the strange tale of this ancient British king. Herla, he tells us, ruled Britain in the oldest of times. Some scholars suggest this places him before the Anglo-Saxon invasions, perhaps in the misty period when the Romano-British culture was giving way to what would become Wales and England. According to Map's account, King Herla was approached by a strange, supernatural being, described as small in stature with red skin, a great beard, and the cloven hooves of a goat partially hidden beneath his rich robes. This being, whom we might recognize as a dwarf king or fairy lord from folklore, invited Herla to attend his wedding feast. Though surely wary, Herla agreed, for in those days, to refuse such an invitation might bring terrible consequences. The fairy king departed, promising to return in exactly 1 year to escort Herla to the celebration. True to his word, the fairy king returned when the year had passed. King Herla, having prepared rich gifts for the wedding, departed with the strange visitor and a small retinue of his most trusted men. What followed would trap King Herla between worlds and condemn him and his men to ride the night skies for eternity, a fate that would give birth to the legend of the wild hunt in Britain. King Herla and his men followed the fairy king through forests and across streams until they came to a great cliff face. Whether it seemed to be solid stone, a doorway opened, leading into the heart of the mountain itself. Inside, they discovered a realm of impossible splendor. Map describes caves that glowed with their own inner light, illuminating riches beyond mortal imagining. The air was filled with strange, beautiful music played on instruments unknown to human hands. The fairy wedding feast was a display of supernatural excess that dazzled the mortal guests. Foods and wines of unearthly delicacy were served in abundance, while entertainment of surpassing strangeness and beauty was provided for the revelers. King Herla presented his gifts, which were received with great honor, and in turn, he and his men were lavished with fairy treasures, gold, gems, fine fabrics, and hunting birds and hounds of supernatural quality. Time, as it often does in fairy tales, moved differently in this otherworldly realm. What seemed to Herla and his men to be perhaps 3 days of feasting was, in reality, something quite different, though they would not discover this terrible truth until later. As the festivities concluded, the fairy king thanked Herla for honoring his wedding with his presence. In parting, he gave the British king one final gift, a small bloodhound, which could be carried in the palm of a hand. The fairy king gave specific instructions none of Herla's party should dismount from their horses upon returning to their own realm until the little dog jumped down from its bearer's arms. With these cryptic instructions and laden with fairy gifts, Herla and his men were guided back to the entrance of the mountain hall, emerging once more into the world of mortals. When King Herla and his company emerged from the fairy mountain, the world they knew had vanished. The forest seemed different, the paths unfamiliar. Confused, they encountered an elderly shepherd tending his flock along the hillside. Herla hailed the man and asked for news of his kingdom. The shepherd looked at the resplendent king with confusion, then growing astonishment as he realized who stood before him. "Sir," the old man replied in a language that seemed strangely altered yet still comprehensible to Herla, "I scarcely understand your speech, for you are a Briton, and I am a Saxon. The name of King Herla I have indeed heard in ancient tales, the king who disappeared with his retinue over 200 years ago, and who is said to have visited the realm of the fairy folk. Many believed he and his men were lost forever or had perished long ago. 200 years had passed in the mortal world, while Herla had feasted for what seemed mere days. His kingdom was gone, conquered by the Saxons. His castle, his queen, his subjects, all had crumbled to dust centuries ago. As this terrible realization dawned upon the king and his men, one of the knights, overcome with shock, forgot the fairy king's warning and dismounted from his horse. The moment his foot touched the soil of the mortal world, his body crumbled instantly into dust, 2 centuries claiming their due in a single moment. Horrified, Herla reminded his remaining companions of the fairy king's warning none should dismount until the small bloodhound leapt from its bearer's arms. Understanding now the cruel trick played upon them, for the dog, being of fairy nature, would likely never jump down, Herla and his remaining men were condemned to ride eternally, and so began the endless journey of King Herla and his hunting party, forever caught between worlds, unable to rest, unable to die, the first and most terrible manifestation of what would come to be known as the Wild Hunt. According to Walter Mapp's account, King Herla and his men rode frantically at first, searching for any sign of their lost kingdom or people who might remember them. But centuries had erased all they knew. Eventually, they came to understand the full extent of their curse. They could not dismount without turning to dust. The fairy hound would never jump down. They were trapped in an eternal ride through a land that was no longer theirs. Mapp tells us that for centuries after their return, they were occasionally glimpsed riding in wild procession through remote parts of Britain, their appearance growing more spectral and otherworldly with each passing generation. Their fine clothes became tattered, their faces gaunt and ghostly, their horses transformed into skeletal beasts with flaming eyes. The fairy treasures they carried glittered with an unearthly light. The chronicler suggests that during the first year of the reign of King Henry II, around 1154, something remarkable happened. After being sighted along the border between Wales and Herefordshire for centuries, King Herla's wild procession was seen plunging into the waters of the River Wye. After this final appearance, Mapp claims they were never seen again. Some interpretations suggest this represents Herla finally finding rest, perhaps because the bloodhound at last jumped from his arms, releasing him and his men from their curse. Others propose a more troubling interpretation that Herla and his hunters simply moved from the visible world into the realm of pure spirit, becoming even more dangerous as they transformed fully into what we now know as the Wild Hunt. This transformation is key to understanding how an ancient British king became associated with the broader European legend of the Wild Hunt, a spectral procession that brings doom to all who witness it. While we have focused on the legend of King Herla, it is important to understand that similar tales of the wild hunt appear across Europe, with different leaders and different origins, yet remarkably similar in their core elements. In Germanic regions, the hunt was most commonly led by Wotan or Odin, the wandering god with his wide-brimmed hat and single eye. His 8-legged horse Sleipnir carried him at the head of a procession of the dead, particularly those who died violently in battle. In the Alpine regions, the wild hunt often represented the souls of unbaptized children or those who died before their time, led by a female figure sometimes identified as Perchta or Holger. In parts of France, the hunt was led by Harlequin, a demonic figure whose name evolved into Harlequin, originally far more sinister than the colorful trickster of later theatrical traditions. In later English tradition, particularly in the Windsor Forest region, the leader of the hunt became Herne the Hunter, a forest spirit with antlers growing from his head, said to be a former royal gamekeeper who had hanged himself from an oak tree after falling from royal favor. What connects these diverse traditions? Some scholars see in them ancient memories of shamanic practices, where ritual leaders would journey to the spirit world. Others find echoes of migration-era warrior bands whose raids seem supernatural in their speed and ferocity. The Christian Church often reinterpreted these pagan traditions as cautionary tales. The wild hunt became a procession of sinners, particularly those who had enjoyed hunting too enthusiastically in life, or who had hunted on holy days when such activities were forbidden. Yet beneath these variations, the core warning remains the same. Those who witness the hunt risk being swept away with it, joining the eternal procession of the damned. What happened to those unfortunate enough to witness the wild hunt? The legends are quite specific and uniformly terrifying. Those who saw the hunt passing overhead faced several possible fates, none of them good. The most fortunate might simply be left with a terrible sense of impending doom, often followed swiftly by the death of a community member or some great catastrophe. Others might be physically swept up by the huntsman and carried away, forced to join the eternal procession of the damned. Some tales speak of mortal witnesses finding themselves instantly transported great distances, awakening hundreds of miles from where they had stood. Most terrifying were the accounts of those who mocked or challenged the hunt. To call out to the spectral hunters, or worse, to attempt to join their pursuit was to invite the most dire consequences. Such foolhardy souls might be torn apart by the supernatural hounds or have game animals thrown at them with such force that they were mortally wounded. Protective measures against the hunt varied by region. In some areas, people would throw themselves face down on the ground, covering their eyes and ears until the sound of ghostly horns and baying hounds had passed. In others, drawing a circle around oneself with a blade or standing at a crossroads was thought to provide protection. Churches would sometimes ring bells during wild storms to ward off the hunt, while prayers to Saint Walpurga or other protective saints were uttered by the faithful. Iron implements, always a defense against fairy folk, were kept close at hand during the dark seasons when the hunt was most active. Yet perhaps the most effective protection was simply to remain indoors on wild nights, shutters closed, doors barred, gathered close to the hearthfire, the ancient symbol of human civilization's fragile triumph over the terrors that roam the darkness. The wild hunt was not thought to ride at all times of the year. Its appearances followed distinct seasonal patterns that reveal much about its origins and meaning. Most commonly, the hunt was associated with the dark half of the year, the period between harvest and spring planting, when nights grow long and the natural world seems to die back. Specifically, the hunt was most frequently reported during the 12 days of Christmas, on the winter solstice, and during the hunger months of deep winter. Other significant times included the spring and autumn equinoxes, Walpurgis night on April 30th, and Samhain, what we now call Halloween, on October 31st. These dates mark what Celtic traditions considered the thin times of the year, when the veil between worlds was at its most permeable. This seasonal association reveals the hunt's connection to deeper mythological patterns. Winter storms with their howling winds naturally evoke the sounds of a spectral hunt. The psychological impact of the dark season, with its scarcity, cold, and increased mortality, makes tales of supernatural doom particularly resonant. Moreover, these are the seasons when communities would gather around hearthfires to share stories. The wild hunt served as a powerful reminder of the dangers lurking beyond the circle of firelight and human companionship. The hunt's association with liminal times, dusk, midnight, the changing of seasons, speaks to its nature as a phenomenon that exists at the boundary between worlds. King Herla and his men were themselves caught between the fairy realm and the human world, between life and death, belonging fully to neither. In this light, the wild hunt can be understood as a powerful metaphor for the human fear of that which exists beyond boundaries, beyond community, beyond civilization, beyond life itself. The wild hunt galloped from oral folklore into written literature, where it has left hoof prints across the centuries. Walter Mapp's account of King Herla from the 12th century represents one of the earliest written recordings, but many others followed. In 1127, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes a terrifying vision witnessed by many wild huntsmen riding furious horses, black and large, and hideous, and their hounds were jet black, with eyes like saucers and horrible. This event was interpreted as an omen presaging serious political turmoil that followed. The 13th century German poem Der wütende Heer directly addresses the wild hunt and its connection to the souls of the unbaptized. Meanwhile, the medieval romantic epic Tannhäuser references the nighttime hunter in its tale of a knight tempted by Venus. By the 19th century, with its revival of interest in folklore, the wild hunt galloped into romantic literature. Sir Walter Scott referenced it in several works, while Jacob Grimm's seminal work, Deutsche Mythologie, catalogued the various Germanic incarnations of the legend. The hunt inspired poetry from Robert Burns to Goethe, and featured in the works of Washington Irving and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. The image of the spectral hunt became a powerful symbol for romantic writers seeking to reconnect with primal folklore and the sublime terror of the supernatural. More recently, the wild hunt has found new life in modern fantasy literature, appearing in the works of authors like J.R.R. Tolkien, who drew inspiration from these ancient legends for his ring wraiths, and in countless other stories, films, and games that tap into this primal image of supernatural pursuit. What makes this legend so enduring in literature? Perhaps it is the perfect encapsulation of what the Romantics called the sublime, that which terrifies and awes us simultaneously, reminding us of forces beyond human control or understanding. What deeper meanings might we find in the persistent legend of the wild hunt? Beyond its supernatural elements, the legend speaks to fundamental human fears and social functions. From a psychological perspective, the wild hunt embodies our fear of chaos and the unknown. The orderly world of medieval village life, with its clear boundaries, rituals, and community, is violated by this eruption of supernatural forces that obey no human law. The hunt represents entropy and wildness, breaking through the fragile barriers of civilization. The hunt's connection to storms and winter reinforces this. Natural forces that threaten medieval subsistence with very real danger. By personifying these threats as a spectral hunt, communities could give shape to formless fears. The social function of the legend is equally illuminating. Tales of the wild hunt reinforce community bonds by emphasizing the dangers that lurk beyond village boundaries. It encouraged people to remain indoors during dangerous weather, avoid traveling on dubious paths at night, and respect seasonal prohibitions that had practical value. For church authorities, the hunt provided a useful moral lesson. Those who indulged excessively in hunting, or who hunted on holy days, might find themselves condemned to join the eternal hunt, a vivid warning against placing worldly pleasures above spiritual obligations. The legend also offered explanation for disturbing but natural phenomena. The sound of geese migrating at night, the howling of wolves, or the noise of winter storms could all be interpreted as the passage of the wild hunt. Perhaps most poignantly, the hunt represented the unquiet dead, those who died violently or before their time, unable to rest peacefully. In societies frequently ravaged by war, disease, and famine, this provided a framework for understanding the psychological trauma of loss and grief. The Wild Hunt of King Herla, a legend that rode through medieval imagination for centuries, continues to gallop through our cultural consciousness today. Though we may no longer fear seeing spectral riders in the storm clouds, the image retains its power to thrill and terrify. What began as the tragic tale of an ancient British king trapped between worlds evolved into one of Europe's most widespread and enduring legends. In King Herla's endless ride, we can see reflections of our own deepest fears of being lost between worlds, of being forgotten by time, of forces beyond our control or understanding. The hunt reminds us that medieval people did not neatly separate the natural from the supernatural, history from myth, or psychological experience from external reality. Their world was more permeable, more mysterious, and in many ways more alive with meaning than our own. Perhaps on dark winter nights, when the wind howls through bare branches, and something not quite identifiable moves at the edge of vision, we modern folk still feel an echo of what our ancestors felt. That primordial recognition that beyond the comfortable boundaries of our known world, wild forces still ride. As for King Herla, legend says he and his hunting party still ride somewhere. Perhaps through remote Welsh valleys, perhaps through the storm clouds overhead, or perhaps through the wilderness of our own imagination, where ancient kings and fairy bargains still hold power. Listen carefully on wild nights. In the howling of the wind, you might just hear the distant horns and baying hounds of the wild hunt.
But remember the old warnings, should you hear them approaching.
Avert your eyes, make the sign of protection, and whatever you do, do not look up. When next we meet, we shall explore the tale of the chess players of Strobek, and how a medieval German village gained fame, fortune, and special privileges through an imprisoned count and a game of strategy. Until then, I am Osric the Tale-Binder, keeper of forgotten legends. Fare thee well, and beware the wild winter nights.